So, a pleasant morning to everyone. My name is Dianrei Paquibot, and today I'm going to teach you about what are the guidelines on interpreting a story. Now, when interpreting a story, varies between readers. As it said, stories don't have a meaning unless they have a reader. So, the interpretation of the story can vary between the readers. Now, there are 10 guidelines on how to properly interpret a story, and we're gonna look to them one by one, and I will explain them one by one to fully understand how it takes to interpret a story. The first guideline is find out what the text is arguing. Don't merely summarize it. So this means that when we interpret a story, we should not interpret it based on what happens on the story. We should interpret it based on its argument. So one example is Romeo and Juliet. So Romeo and Juliet story have many happenings, right? First, we have the fight between the Capulets and the Montagues, the forbidden relationship of Romeo and Juliet, and lastly, they died together, right? So we should not interpret Romeo and Juliet like that, but we should interpret it on what is its argument. So one of its main argument is love versus hate, which basically represents the love between Romeo and Juliet even when they are enemies. And the second guideline is look for the text's main idea. Now there are things that we should consider in looking for the story's main idea. First is we should consider its historical and societal context. Now this context can greatly affect the story's main idea. For example, let's go back to the story Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet was written by William Shakespeare. It is written in the year 1590s. So it is very common to have royalty in that time. And also the fight between families is also very common in that type of society. So that's why in the story Romeo and Juliet, there are dukes, there are princes, there are fights between the families for power, and many more. And also we should consider what does the text have to do with its historical and societal assumption. Now, historical and societal assumption by definition is what are the traditions, the cultures on that time and on the society. So what does the text do, or how can the story relate, or does rather the story relate to the historical and societal assumption? Now the next guideline is the text is a construct, not about a real person or events. So this means that we should always remember that the text in the story is not real events that happens in the real life. Yes, it can be based on real life events, but the story, the text, the dialogues, the events specifically isn't what happened on the real life. So we should always remember that when interpreting the story. The fourth guideline on how to interpret a story is that we must always remember that the character in the story are also constructed. They are not real life people. So this is very well self-explanatory, right? So this means that the characters in the story isn't real life people. Yes, the author can base their characters to real life people, but they shouldn't bring that real people under their story. One example is One Piece. I know some of you guys are familiar with One Piece, right? Now, some characters of One Piece are actually derived from real people, but its author, Eiichiro Oda, didn't really bring that real people into his characters. He changed the attitude, the looks of his characters to not really symbolize that real life people. So pasabot is that kanang dili ato dapat hinumduman nga ang character kay dili tinuod sa, so pwede siya mabase sa tinuod nga people diri sa living world. So dili pasabot na ang nahitabo sa story sa katong nga karakter. Wala kay nahitabo pud sa katong tinuod nga tao nga gibasihan sa author. So sample na isa ka karakter gibasihan baro nako, then na nahitabo dito kay nahimo siyang babae. Pero ang gibasihan ako, pero wala man nahitabo nako kay laki man ko. So you must always remember na ang kanang mga karakter kay possible na sa author, even if nag-base siya sa tinuod nga people. So the fifth guideline on how to interpret the story is that we must remember that what happens in a text may not be what it is arguing for. So pasabot ani kung unsa day nahitabo sa story kay basin dili iyang gi-represent unsay argument sa story. As I said before, dili ta mag-interpret unsa ray nahitabo sa story, but we should interpret on its main argument. And we must remember to distinguish narratives and arguments, as narratives means katong mga nahitabo sa story. Kung sa gipang story sa story, the dialogue, the settings, the events, mao na narrative. And sa argument, mao na unsay main idea or unsay purpose sa author nga no iyan ang gibuhat nga story. So this can be identified by the attitudes of characters in the story. So dili tanan attitude sa character kay mao na ang main argument dito. So basin gibutang na dira sa author for narratives only, dili para sa argument. So when interpreting a story, we should always remember nga bisan na itabo na siya sa kuha, hindi pasabot nga mao ning argument. Kaya ang first, diba, we must interpret it by the argument, main argument. Pero di pasabot na unsay na itabo sa story, mao na nay argument niya. So we must remember that when interpreting a story. So the sixth guideline is that we must determine the positive or negative consequences of the plot, or simply sa mga characters, sa mga consequences sa mga characters. So when interpreting a story, we should remember that a negative consequence against a sympathetic character usually argues about what happened to that character. So pasabutan na ang mga sympathetic mga characters, kaya mga buutan nga characters, we can say they are the protagonists of the story. Kung unsay mga nahitabo nila nga dili maayo nga gi-set up sa author para nila, usually murag ni argue siya kung unsay joy batasan na nga character, unsay nahitabuan nga character, unsay iyang attitude nga character. Whereas we should also remember kung sa mga negative consequences against the unsympathetic character, kay murag ni agree ra siya kung unsay joy mga nahitabuan nga character ra, unsay mga attitude anang character ra, because unsympathetic usually means they are the antagonist, they are the villain, the main villain, pero dili per me, pero murag sila jud ang murag antagonist sa story. So if nay negative consequence may tabo nila, the reader can say ala deserving siya the antagonist, day deserving niya mga negative consequences nga gi-set up sa author niya. Whereas sa katong sympathetic nga character, ni-argue siya kung unsay nahitabo ato nga character sa negative consequences. Like makaingon ta as a reader nga hala anong nahitabo man niya, buutan mga siya nanuging ani man sa author. So mao na siya guys. So we must remember to determine the negative or positive consequences of the plot, not only negative consequences. Like I said, we must determine the positive consequences that happens in the plot when interpreting a story. So manata sa first 6 nga guidelines on how to interpret a story, guys. So let's proceed to ika-7. So ika-7 guideline is we must examine what is the narrative point of view. First person point of view ba siya or the third person? Through what perspective does the story use? So this can be very crucial when interpreting a story. Kay we know nga dahil kay point of view sa pwede nimo i-interpret ang story. So according sa kanang kinsa nga point of view ang gigamit sa pag-interpret sa story, the outcome could be very different, diba? Kay kabaw man ta nga lahi-lahi na sila upuan, naagian. So for example ani na may mga story nga like na ko'y nakita na to nga sa TikTok magor to na siya 5 ka libro and they are very different, murag same sila og timeline but sa katausa ka libro they are dito gi-represent ang ilang respective point of view. So imagine guys, nakato silang 5 kay giusa sa usa ka story. So di ba? So imo ang pag-interpret sa usa ka babae, nailain ka ang pag-interpret niya sa katong usa na pod ka babae. Edi ilang interpretation ilahi pod. Ilahi man nilang point of view nga gigamit sa pag-interpret sa story. So we must remember that nga when interpreting a story, importante kayo nga ato ma-determine kung unsa yung gigamit sa story nga point of view. First person ba siya kanang sa character nga story nga point of view or sa third person, or basically kanang the story sa story. Dili siya character sa story but siya ang story sa story. So mao na guys. So manata sa first 7 nga guidelines, no? Manata sa first 7 nga guidelines. So let's proceed to ika-8. So ika-8 nga guideline when interpreting a story is that we must examine what is the imagery being used in the story. It can be symbolism, metaphor, or similes. Basta makaluwas ani if na ba siya sa story. Because it is very important when interpreting a story na makabaw ta aning nila kadaw sila metaphor, symbolism kay those things or those kaning-kaning nga tulo makatago ni sila og meaning that is used siya sa author para makatago og meaning. So for example, symbolism. Let's go general. So unsa may gi-symbolizes sa light? Di ba hope? Ang basa naagay light na murag light na word murag gigamit siya as symbol as a hope. Di ba? Maumana. So ingana na siya. Pwede siya gamitin sa mga author to fully effectively hide a meaning para mas amusing ilang story. So, if mag-interpret na sa story, di ba, manatagbasa. Kaya, so, mo ito pag-interpret kung wala pa nakabasa, di ba? So, when reading a story, sa tanggabasa pa lang ta, we should look for those things. Symbolism, metaphor, and simile. Mangita ta ato sa story and try to determine kung sa'y meaning nila for better interpreting a story. So, one example na is sa Romeo and Juliet. Balik ka sa Romeo and Juliet. So, sa Romeo and Juliet, diba, kabamanta nga, nagkatig-atig to pakapatay si Rose. Gatik-atik mo na siya, no? Para makataka siya siyang pamilya. But Romeo didn't know about this man, diba? So, nipalit siya og poison sa apothecary. So, that poison actually symbolizes the poison of Romeo. Kabamon sa poison ni Romeo, which is murasyag na buang sa love. He is very willing to sacrifice himself because he is willing to sacrifice to kill himself when he knew that the love of his life is also dead, which is not true by the way kay diba nangatkate siya pakapatay. So mao na siya symbolize sa poison. One thing is that nato yung word dialogue na gikuan, Juliet's eyes are stars. So pasabot ani ni Romeo is ang mga mata ni Juliet is very nice. They are heavenly bodies in the space sa kanindot. So diba it is very important to determine that kay para ma-effective na to interpret ang story ba. Okay, when we interpret a story, kanang interpret sa story, then ato siya i-share sa lain. If sayo pa to pagka-interpret, di ba atong information na apunta sa lain ni sayop na po. So, mana siya guys. So, important na siya. So, manata sa 8 guys. Hapit na lang to. Hano na dyan ka po. So, the 9th guideline says that while you may want to focus on one aspect of the text, do not forget to put it or place it within the context of the text. So, kita mga human beings, creative mga itong mind. So, when interpreting a story, kabaw ko, dagan kita kinahan idagdag ipuno ng context sa katong pag-interpret nato sa story. So, okay ra na siya. It is fairly acceptable if maging ana. But when magbuhat agi nga na mopalayo kita sa main idea sa text, we must remember na dapat connected siya sa main idea sa text. Dili siya murang layo na kayo. Kaya if layo na kayo pagka-interpret, layo imong context, parang mausab ang story, di ba? So, imagine nyo nga ni, nag-interpret ka sa Maria and Ibarra na nun, Maria and Ibarra. Nag-interpret ka sa No Limit Dianrei. Pero pag-interpret nyo man, I will have powers. So, No Limit Dianrei pa din. Di ba? Dili. So, dapat when pwede na maging hanap. Pero, mura siya subsection sa katong main idea sa story. So, ang kuha na to, no, sa No Limit Dianrei, kaya mara man itong story about Ibarra and ni Maria Clara. So, pwede ito makuhaan nga mga consequences sa love. Kasi mga benefits sa love. Mga nga ba? At, di ba, at least kuhaan siya sa love, connected siya sa love. Mag-story ka power about sa No Limit Dianrei. Layo na nga siya. No, interpret, you can say, yung pagka-interpret sa No Limit Dianrei, sayop na. Kaya layo na kikatapos. So, it is important, guys, na when interpreting, we can choose one side of the context, but relate it with the main context of the story. So, nanata sa 10th guideline, guys, the last guideline. So, dili na ito magpadugay-dugay pa. So, the 10th guideline says that be careful not to read the text on what is not found, but we must always find textual evidence to fully support your beliefs on what is really occurring in the story. So pasabot ana kay when we are reading the story, kay di ba, when we interpret a story, we must read the story first, of course. So when we are reading it, we must read it based on facts. Dili lang guess. Dili lang natay word nga dili familiar, kuan garo ni bla bla bla. Dili nga na. Dapat mag-search jud ta unsay meaning nga word for truly kanang ma-effective ang inyong interpretation. And we must always find textual evidence pwede ta mangita sa other stories nga similar or concept sa inyong story nga gi-interpret to fully kanang mahimo jud nga effective inyong interpretation. Ang mubasa sa interpretation kay makuha jud sakto niya ha kay nay mga evidence, di ba? Isa man hindi mo tuo sa mga evidence, sa mga factual evidence, mga psycho or girl. So if when we are reading a story, we must search for textual evidence for better interpretation of the story. So that is all, guys. Those are the 10 guidelines on how to properly interpret a story. So I hope nga naman nakatunan one or two things man from me. Balag libog-libog ang explanation. And I want you guys to interpret your own story or interpret a story that you want to interpret. And use this 10 guidelines or use the 10 guidelines I just mentioned on your interpretation of the story, and let's see kung sakto ba jud or mas mo better ang inyong pagka-interpret sa story when you are using those 10 guidelines of how to interpret a story. So more to, guys. Bye bye.